to today's seminar. I'm honored to introduce the speaker for today in the person of Dr. Xavier Fazio. Dr. Xavier Fazio holds a doctorate degree in curriculum and instruction from the University of Toronto. Currently, he's an associate professor in the Department of Teacher Education at Brock University. He has taught undergraduate courses in science, teacher education, and environmental education for secondary teacher candidates and graduate courses in learning and cognition, along with science curriculum at Brock. Before this, he was a science consultant for a school district in Ontario and was a secondary school biology and environmental science teacher. As it relates to environmental sustainability, his research focuses on promoting scientific and environmental literacy with students and teachers in educational contexts. Today, he will be speaking to us on teaching and learning for environmental sustainability. Shall we welcome Dr. Xavier?
And I just want to thank Professor Palmer for inviting me to come and speak to you all today. And we had a little bit of technical difficulty, so hopefully things will be okay. We heard a bit about who I am, but I'm going to tell you a little bit about myself from a slightly different perspective. I think it's important, being new to the center, I wanted everyone to get a little sense of my history, and I think the history we bring to the center helps us to better collaborate, and I think it's important to hear my story and how my story will be changing in the near future. A little bit about sustainable education in terms of its history and definition of terms and some of the challenges with that. I'll introduce you to the idea of complexity as it relates to education, teaching and learning specifically. And finally, I'll focus in on social learning perspectives and how important that is for environmental sustainability. Now, I prefer people asking me questions. If you have a question, pressing questions during my presentation, by all means, just put up your hand and we'll address it there. I know we'll have time afterwards for questions, but don't feel shy. And I have thick skin, so don't worry if you have something challenging to ask me. So there I am, and if you don't believe me, that's kind of me, right? Teaching high school. I taught high school biology, chemistry, and I also had the chance to teach environmental science. And my teaching began a while back, over 2 decades ago, actually. And part of my teaching involved, obviously, classroom teaching, but also some of my students here teaching in the outdoors. And trying to link those two together was a challenge. It's a challenge not only in a secondary school context, but in an elementary school context. It's a challenge in the post-secondary context. So the question is, can you better do this? We'll talk a little bit about that, but those challenges sort of propelled me to think about what else can be done. And I began to, at the university, explore 2 avenues. First of all, I wanted to see successful programs in both K-12 contexts, as well as successful programs in teacher education programs. So my area is primarily science teacher education, environmental education, and I work with teacher candidates, as you can see in the middle, and I teach a course with them on how to more effectively teach environmental education or education for environmental sustainability. But I also work with schools as well, and we look at some best practices in terms of what they're doing. Now, I'm going to preface something right off the bat. I'm going to use the term environmental education, sustainability education, education for environmental sustainability synonymously, okay? I don't mean to confuse you, but there's a reason, and I'm going to tell you the reason why this is one of the challenges in the area, but just to let you know. So some of the new perspectives. After beginning to look at schools, I began sort of a more personal exploration, and I did this with a colleague here as well, Dr. Doug Carroll, who is also in the Faculty of Education. And we began to look at environmental monitoring programs. And traveled in a few places, as you can see here, the Great Smoky Mountains, that's in Georgia, and that's in Alberta. And we began to look at how can we better link schools with environmental monitoring programs. And we came up with the term that you've probably heard about, citizen science. Now, how many of you have never heard about citizen science? can just raise your hand. Okay, we have a couple of people there. Citizen science, as the name suggests, is science done by citizens. But who is a citizen? Well, we're all citizens in some ways. Some of us are professional scientists that are citizens. Some of us are amateur scientists who are also citizens. Some of us are 16 years old. Some of us are 75 years old. So it really is a broad swath of society. What we wanted to do is look at some of the abiotic and biotic monitoring programs and start to think about how can we better connect to schools. And this seemed like a fairly straightforward and simple proposition. But we have to consider a couple things. When we connect to schools, we have to think about how are we connecting. So citizen science actually falls under a larger umbrella idea called public participation in scientific research. And the way of participating the community and the society communicating with scientists has a lot to do with either the communication component or citizen science component. The citizen science component has two main elements. There is a volunteer distributed type of component to it, and it's sort of do-it-yourself or DIY science. And those have a lot of challenges with it. But in the last 50 years, there's been a lot of efforts with a lot of organizations trying to make this more a part of the research that actually scientists do, and more importantly, collaborating with universities to make this happen. So this is something that I'm very interested in doing and trying to get funding to do more of this, et cetera. But just to give you a little context about citizen science. So what did we do? What we did is we looked at programs, and these programs, some of you may recognize this. This is from Nature Canada. Nature Canada works with Environment Canada in some ways, and what they do is have a lot of programs that are for outreach. But one of the arms that they had was a group called the Environmental Monitoring and Assessment Network, and that began in 1994. And we reached out to them and through Environment Canada, and they were actually willing to work with us. So we partnered with Environment Canada to try to implement these programs, which were not originally aimed at schools, but to work with school systems. They're easy to use, validated scientifically, and have a lot of reliable methods from which to collect data. We began working with schools, in particular, the most popular, well, I'm going to ask you, which do you think is the most popular program schools attracted themselves to? So there's Frog Watch, Plant Watch, the exciting Ice Watch, and of course Worm Watch. What do you think?
Frog Watch.
Good, that was the second most popular.
Plant.
Yeah.
Plant Watch.
Not Plant Watch. It was a good reason for Plant Watch. If you think about when plants emerge and things like that, it's hard to always get that time. Worm Watch, absolutely. Worm Watch, and here we are working with elementary and secondary schools, and in particular the right one. This is actually downtown Hamilton, okay, right downtown in an urban center, trying to find worms. So the words they use is flip, strip, and dig, right? You know, you can really get kids into that when you say we're going to do some flipping of grass, we're going to do some stripping in a way, and we're going to dig for worms. So we worked with these schools, and we found that there were incredible outcomes for the students, but also the educators, because this was also new to them. This is not something they necessarily connect to, right? They're used to working in classroom settings, sometimes going to outdoor education settings, but they're not necessarily used to working in their local community, and especially with these environmental protocols. So we were excited to move forward with this, and then you know, a new government came in, the federal government, and eliminated the entire program. Environmental Monitoring Assessment Network was axed, all in 6 months. We had a contract with Environment Canada, et cetera. Everything was ready to go for expanding the protocols with schools. So we were really disappointed when that happened, but luckily with the change of tide and change of government, we seem to be maybe getting a bit more traction with that. So the heart of my presentation, I want to talk about an idea. I'm going to ask you this question. I want you to think about it. What does education for environmental sustainability mean to you? I want you to think a few seconds and maybe share with someone beside you.
I'm also thinking on the broad sense, really like it can mean so many of those education can be for like formal or like teaching the fundamentals of like communities. They've actually done what about you, what is your
Okay, so I sort of don't want to disrupt your discussions, and I use this just to give you a sense to start thinking about what this means to you, and you'll soon see that this concept, this construct means a lot of things to a lot of people, depending where you are, who you are, etc., and your role in society. So who'd like to share? Anyone like to share their notion of education for environmental sustainability, what it means to you? Yes, please, go ahead. Sorry, I don't know your name, so.
My name is Yuka.
Yuka, please.
I don't know if I can explain this well, but I have learned that for children, for especially science, they have a pure curiosity for the nature rules, but they don't have like exact knowledge to like find a common rule for the nature rule, if that makes sense.
Okay.
And the role for teachers for children is to give them context of the science in order to unpack their curiosity and then give them like solutions and methodology to tackle other problems related to the initial ones.
Okay.
And what is environmental sustainability in terms in relation to education is, I think, to add one more component than science, so that's the environmental sustainability piece, in order to give them context of how to solve problems or like how to tackle nature itself.
That's great. I mean, that's a very thorough answer.
Yeah.
Wonderful, wonderful. I mean, that's it. And what I like about your response is that you connected to a lot of different ideas, right? A lot of different concepts that are embedded within that general idea, and I think it's important to unpack those and explain those and articulate those. When we do the research, looking at and asking people this exact same questions, if we ask academics, they'll have a somewhat different response than you'll ask practitioners. And academics see a more integrated perspective, whereas practitioners have a more focused, this is what it is, I don't necessarily see a connection to that. It's not they disagree with it, but they just don't use that. And that's important to know because here, I don't want you to read all 80 of these, but these are things that connect to education for environmental sustainability. This is known as the ejectable educational piece. So I put an adjective in front of education and you get a connection somehow to sustainability. Sometimes it's explicit if you look at some of the topics like environmental education, sustainability education, education for sustainable development, outdoor education. But there's also other ones that actually use sustainability in their definition, in their outcomes, in their processes as well. And so this is why this term, I guess the best way to describe it, it's known as an empty signifier. And an empty signifier is a term that is so broad and so vast, while meaningful, has so many definitions and so many approaches that it's contextually dependent on the individuals, the context, the roles of the individuals in society, etc. In academia, my opinion, this has actually caused a lot of problems. It has actually slowed progress in the field, at least in sustainability education and environmental education. Because we're arguing a lot about what it is and what it isn't, what it should be, how do we change it? What if someone co-opts the term and takes it and uses it? So the way I like to see and describe this is using called the 3 Ps. Education for environmental sustainability ultimately involves people, place, and I'm going to use prosperity. although some people have substituted prosperity for profit, but, and there's contentious aspects to that, but 3 Ps. Your definition of sustainability should have that. Now, let me give you an example from Ontario. In Ontario, I don't know, many of you know, we have a policy document for K-12 schools with respect to environmental education. Notice the term, okay? Sustainability education is not used in Ontario because of the history. Within that framework, this is how they describe it. Education about the environment, for the environment, and in the environment, and promotes an understanding of rich and active experience in and an appreciation for the dynamic interactions. So it includes looking at physical and biological systems, dependency of social economic systems, scientific and human dimensions, etc., both positive and negative consequences. It's a very rich, large, all-encompassing definition. Notice the term that's not there. Sustainability. Now, is it implied? Absolutely. Would anyone argue, who, the policymakers and the practitioners that constructed this policy document would say that's not important? Of course they'll say it's important, but notice the term is missing. So nomenclature is important, but at the same time we have to be cognizant of its limitations in terms of preventing us from moving forward and taking action. So it's really important. Another thing to remember from a Canadian context is that every province has jurisdictional control over education. That includes K-16, elementary, secondary, and post-secondary. So we don't have a Canada-wide description of sustainability education, education for environmental sustainability, or environmental education. So you can go to another province and they'll start to use sustainability education. For example, Manitoba. They do use sustainability education much more than they use environmental education. Ontario, it's almost exclusively environmental education and outdoor education. Those contextual differences matter. So for some of you who are interested in doing pan-Canadian work, for example, you probably are recognizing the differences. Marcia McKenzie out of University of Saskatchewan has a center that looks at sustainability and policies and has looked at some of the educational policy differences across Canada, both in the territories as well as the provinces. And again, she highlights, and her grad students have highlighted some of these differences. So that'd be an important avenue to explore if you're interested in doing that. Now, a little bit of history, and you may know this already, so I'll just quickly go through this, but the term sustainability education actually is only about 25 years old, even though the term sustainability probably appeared in the literature, and correct me if I'm wrong, this is something I've read, but in the 1800s, where we looked at sustainability practices with agricultural and forestry practices. Sustainability education, or education for sustainability and all its variants, actually appeared at the famous Rio Summit in 1992, okay? And we had a Canadian delegation there, and speaking to one of the Canadian delegates, who currently is a UNESCO chair for education for environmental sustainability and development, Chuck Hopkins, he mentioned that the term development, that term right here, had to be added right at the end for countries to sign on. In other words, it didn't exist until that. So there's particular dynamic forces in play when it comes to the concepts. Now in 2005, if you remember where you were in 2005, that was the beginning of the decade for education for sustainable development. And I'm just laughing because I'm thinking where I was in 2005. I was just starting my career here at Brock. So this wasn't really a highlight at the university. It wasn't highlighted by the provincial government. It wasn't highlighted in Canada. The decade is done. It ended in 2015. So how did we do? How did Canada do over the decade? Well, it's a really difficult question to answer because we actually have no metrics. We have no way of assessing our impact in terms of affecting school systems, post-secondary systems, etc. Some people have tried, doing survey work and try to say, what are you doing in sustainability education? For example, we have a center here, which is obviously promoting a lot of sustainability education, but is there any other way to do this? Of course, you can do it through teacher education programs, you can do it in K-12 school context, etc. But we actually don't have a national system. In fact, we don't have a provincial system. In fact, we don't even have a university way system of even garnering what we're doing in sustainable education, even within Brock University. So this is, again, one of the ways we need to move forward, I believe, to try to promote this agenda. Most of you should know what decade, well, more than a decade actually, we're into the Sustainable Development Goals, and we have 17 goals now to transform our world. Now, these goals are very integrated, and if you look for education, they're only in two spots, number 4, and to a certain extent, number 17. Quality education. Now, quality education is a lot about basic education, like basic literacy, that kind of thing. It obviously links to education for environmental sustainability, but it's not very strong. And this Partnership for the Goals actually talks about how do we partner to actually integrate all this. Well, they talk about education. So one of the worrying things for me is that somehow somebody's kind of said, well, we're done with the decade, now we're moving on to other things. And we're sort of taking that educational piece and moving it a bit to the side or making it implicit. And when you make it implicit, policymakers don't pay attention to it. And when policymakers don't pay attention to it, it gets the agenda, it loses its position on the agenda. Now, during that decade, and I don't expect you to read this, but this was a document that came out, talked about what can we do to help practitioners try to implement education for sustainable development. They came out with this document that was based on a seed document called The Future of Education. And they had 4 elements to that future of education: learning to know, learning to do, learning to be, and learning to live together. Now, just to expand a little bit about these refer to particular competencies. Now, a competency is not an objective or an outcome necessarily. It's a broad framework that encompasses knowledge, skills, sometimes dispositions as well. And they're meant to be unpacked in order to use them for educational programming. But it's a great place to start. However, you can't just leave the competencies there and expect people to use them effectively. A good analogy is 21st century competencies. You probably heard about this term. What does it mean? Well, you'll see some examples of it, but actually put it into practice, you actually have to unpack it quite a bit. So learning to know refers to understanding biological, for example, concepts, ecological concepts, environmental challenges. Learning to do refers to developing practical skills and action. Learning to be is more of an individual development where you develop personal skills that helps you to do and to know. For example, developing resilience. I mean, developing personal resilience helps you in terms of teaching resilience and in fact, being able to share that with others. And finally, learning to live and work together. I believe that collaborative piece is where we need to go. And that's where sort of I'd like to go now is where what we like to refer to as social learning. So I'm going to focus on this, but I just want to make one particular point. It doesn't mean, because we have a short time today, it doesn't mean this is the only way that we need to move forward. All of these competencies are important, but just for today, we're going to focus on one of the more important competencies. Now, just to go back to school a little bit and talk about school and talk about education. Joseph Schwab, a theorist, a curriculum theorist from the 60s and 70s, came up with this basic idea of what he called the commonplaces of schooling. Now, it doesn't mean schooling means it occurs in a school per se, but when you organize an educational experience, you're going to have a teacher, a student, a subject, and then you're going to have the context where it occurs. You can use this and transpose this anywhere, whether it be working in a conservation area, whether it be in a post-secondary setting, elementary school, secondary school, preschool, it doesn't really matter. But those commonplaces are always there. And if they're not, then you really don't have the complete picture of education. Importantly, though, these elements may seem quite simple, but the way they interact is actually very complex and very dynamic. So this is sort of an illustration that actually was from the work of Brent Davies and Dennis Sumera, who are educational theorists in Canada out west. And what they've done in the last 15 years is actually looked at learning systems as complex systems. So they see teaching and learning as very dynamic. They're naturally interdisciplinary. They have all the different elements, all the elements of a complex system, things like emergence, things like networking, things like hierarchy, right? Those kind of elements that you would find in a complex ecological system, you also find in a learning system. And that's one of the things that has been a big shift. So that they recommended is using complexity theory, more specifically complexity thinking, and using that to apply to educational challenges. And I think there's a really strong analog between using that complexity thinking to studying ecological crises, ecological situations that we need to deal with, as well as studying complex situations that happen in the classroom. So a way of looking at learning, you probably know of a basic definition of learning. Learning is a change in your knowledge, change in your skills, change in your attitudes. That's sort of a basic definition. But looking at it from a complex thinking perspective, learning can be seen as an adaptation, both an adaptation to the internal environment as well as the external environment. And that continuous process of adaptation is something that I think is more powerful because it lends itself to some of the complexity perspectives that I think are important and that we see not only in our local ecosystems, but in our classrooms as well. So with that in mind, I want you to look at this environment. This is a picture taken of an Ontario cornfield. What kind of, or what type of learning system is this? Now, you don't have to answer that. It's somewhat rhetorical, but I know there's some people thinking about it. Think about that and compare it to this. What kind of learning can occur here? And the limitations of this environment in terms of learning. See, I call this the monoculture of learning, right? It's very transmissive, very didactic, very one way, because the environment itself is constraining the type of opportunities that could happen. I want you to compare that to this kind of environment. This is a photograph I took out west. Notice it has both human and natural elements to it. So what kind of learning environment is that? And then what can we do in that kind of learning environment? And what kind of learning is imbued here? And this I would call social learning. This is an example of how you take the environment and use it to construct a social learning system. Now I'm going to unpack this a little bit and talk about the elements of a social learning system. But again, I just want you to use this. It is somewhat of a metaphor, and I do appreciate there's limitations to using this. But again, think of that, then think of this, and then think of this, right? This kind of social learning system cannot happen in a lecture hall, right? And it's really important to acknowledge the limitations of our learning environments in terms of potentially dealing with some of the challenges we want to deal with environmentally. So to try to link this together, this is a figure from Berger in terms of ecological modeling, ecosystem services, and society. And what I like about this model is it brings those 3 Ps, the people, the place, and prosperity, connects them together into these networks. And you have these feedback loops. And these feedback loops can be both vicious type of feedback loops, negative type of feedback loops. They can also be positive type of feedback loops as well. It depends on the connections. So just a simple example, if you look at technological innovations, some extractive technologies for oil and gas. When these extractive technologies are produced and developed and refined, you in turn have very different effect on ecosystem services. Compare that to solar technology and how that will impact. So this is important because it feeds back. But notice how it feeds back into the ecosystem. It feeds back into our human system, which in turn affects what is known as our cultural system. This is where education fits in. Education fits in here because culture and education are complicit. The only way culture changes is through an educational process. That's how it changes. And education can be implicated in all these levels. They're not necessarily going to be done the same way, but it's important to acknowledge that. So I just wanted to make that point that sometimes we see human systems and we see biophysical systems and we say, okay, well obviously they're connected, but education is an important mediator within those connections. Now this is a diagram, it's a kind of bold diagram. It's taken from Arjen Wall's book. Arjen Wall was formerly a UNESCO chair in sustainability and education in the Netherlands, and now he works out in the Netherlands and I believe at the University of Gothenburg in Sweden as well. And he's done a lot of thinking about education, learning, and sustainability. And what he did is he adapted from Hurst's book. And just to unpack this, here we have sort of a crisis situation. In that crisis situation, we have a lot of chaos, a lot of dissonance, a lot of deconstruction. Think of that as an environmental type of crisis. The only way out of that is you have to change the routines. You have to change the way you deal with not only the knowledge, but also the actual practices. But how do you go about changing those routines? Well, in turn, you have to embed new knowledge, new relationships, new ways, new norms into that community, which in turn will feed back, again, in terms of some emergent ideas, new ways of doing things, and that will hopefully help ameliorate the crisis. And you can see that this is very, the boundaries are very unclear. It's ambiguous. It's purposely done this way because there actually is no defined way of, I first do this, then I do this, then I do that, and then I do that. It's this to and fro process that is very dynamic, and that is one of the essence of complexity thinking. So keeping this in mind, how do we organize learning to try to accomplish this? Well, it's to create a social learning system. So, social learning system. So here's a model of a social learning system. This is taken from the seminal work of Jean Lab and Etienne Wenger. Jean Lab is a social anthropologist, now retired from Harvard. Etienne Wenger now does a consulting company as well, looking at communities of practice. Communities of practice, you may have heard the term, it actually builds our social learning systems. And they have 6 elements to them. First of all, you have the intermediary elements, which are the domain of practice, meaning what are we doing? What are we focusing on? What's the challenge? Do we understand what we need to do? The second is the community or the agents that are involved, the participants. The third are the actual practices that we need to engage in. Now, we may not know everything up front, but those are the 3 elements that make up the learning partnership. Now, the often forgotten parts of this are the 3 arrows. You can see these 3 arrows impinging upon the social learning system. The participation. Who participates and who doesn't participate, and who can participate at maybe a later point, and who can provide information into the system is a critical part of the social learning system. Finally, the second part is the facilitation. Who is leading this social learning system, and how are they leading? Facilitation implies a different type of leadership. It doesn't imply an authoritarian type of leading. It implies more of a servant leadership model or facilitative model, but it's important to have individuals that will take on this role. And finally, the last one, which is everyone's concern, are resources. These are the financial and material resources required to make this happen. If any of these elements are not in place, then you're really jeopardizing the sustainability of this social learning system over time. And with the research that I've done in schools looking at exemplary environmental education programs, one of the things is that we definitely identified these social learning systems in schools. But what we also began to identify, and I know it might be a little bit small, is we asked some of these challenges in terms of what are the key challenges. And you'll note that the challenges that they have in terms of teaching for environmental sustainability have a lot to do with the resources and the facilitation of environmental education or environmental sustainability practices. Looked at differently, by the way, these are red because they're significantly different in terms of some of the other things, if you want to look at them statistically. Look at differently, if you want to look at a whole school approach, you actually see the same thing. Notice the challenges: school district policy guidelines, government policy guidelines, funding. These are the challenges that the practitioners are talking about. So it's not a knowledge issue. It's not even necessarily the practices. It's not even the actual learning partnership. It's those other pieces that are not in place or not sufficient enough for them to sustain. And this is where you get what's called burnout, right? We identify the mavericks within these school systems that will take this initiative and move it forward, and eventually they burn out because those important support factors are not in place. So I believe that learning for sustainability is one of the most important things that we need to do to help deal with some of these environmental challenges. And I believe it has a lot of positive, maybe unintended, but positive outcomes that it connect to. So when you see a lot of initiatives happening, you can see that things like international education, global citizenship, children's rights, connecting with nature, etc. A lot of these are positive consequences of focusing in on learning for sustainability and living in a more peaceful world. So here we have an example of a group of individuals who've taken upon themselves to clean up and restore a local area. And this is sort of the classic, it's Earth Week, let's go out and do something kind of activity, right? And it make everyone feel good. And it does make everyone feel good. And are there some positive outcomes that go beyond than just cleaning up and restoring the natural area? Of course. For example, when you actually clean up the area, then that makes it a bit more attractive, which in turn can actually invite more people into the area, which in turn can lead to more economic benefits to the community. Those are things that a small activity can actually lead to fairly significant impacts. However, it's not necessarily sustainable. These are nice activities to do, but unless there's a social learning system built in where they have all the pieces in place, this is going to be a one-off. This is going to happen one and done. And that's unfortunate. And if we're going to deal with some of the wicked problems that, remember, Professor Jones talked about last month in his seminar, we're going to have to start thinking carefully about the pedagogies we use to teach for environmental sustainability. So I just want to leave you with a quote. So whatever the future holds, people will require flexibility, resilience, creativity, participatory skills, material restraint, and a sense of ethical responsibility for people in place. Indeed, an education oriented towards nurturing these qualities will help determine a positive and hopeful future. So again, thank you for your attention, and I have some additional readings, including some references that I mentioned during my presentation. Thank you. And I'm looking forward to questions. So, any questions? Yes, Anna.
So thank you for that presentation. That was really interesting. And I have so many questions, and I'm trying to narrow it down in my head right now,
Sure.
which one I want to ask, but maybe we can chat after.
Absolutely.
I actually don't know what to start with. I should have thought this
First
through.
one that pops to mind.
First one that pops to mind. I'm wondering what you think about the Quebec curriculum, actually.
The new curriculum?
Yeah, the new one.
Yeah, I've only had a brief look at that. I find it has some positives in terms of some of the competencies that they're trying to promote. but I haven't done a fine grade analysis of the curriculum. Maybe you can elaborate, what are some things that you remember seeing, because I know you have experience in
Yeah,
college.
I'm more familiar with that
Yeah.
curriculum. So for example, the grade 10 science curriculum, the way they've designed it is topic-based, so an entire unit on climate change, then you break it down for biology, chemistry, and so on.
Yeah.
And then an entire unit on water and so on. And then there's also the competencies they have a
Yeah.
specific list of competencies that are really integrated within the curriculum. So.
Well, I mean, just to compare to Ontario, I mean, our Ontario curriculum, it has a topic on climate change and things like that, but unfortunately, the other topics have no connection to that. So where teachers struggle is they can't actually make interdisciplinary connections. So it becomes this standalone unit, and then they have to teach the periodic table, and then they have to teach optics, and it becomes very difficult for them to implement. And I like that approach, because what it does, it gives us sort of a thematic thread for implementing more successful practices. And then teachers have more buy-in. When you approach them with a program and you say, hey, why don't you try to do more citizen science programs with your students, then they'll say, yeah, I can see it connects to multiple points in my curriculum, and it makes it more accessible for me. Whereas if it's just in one small segment of the curriculum, they're going to say, wow, that's going to be a lot of effort for one element, right? So I agree. I think they're on the right path, and our curriculum certainly needs updating. It's over, our secondary curriculum is also a decade old. So.
That was another question I was going to ask about what you thought about the Ontario curriculum. And I think what you discussed about resources is really important, because I found when I was in schools, that was the biggest thing, that it was a lot of effort for teachers, so having those resources available is...
Yeah, absolutely,
The
and the resources are there, and it's not the will. I think we've gone past this point of where we have to convince people that the environment is really important. We don't need to do that anymore. We really don't. We may have to deal with particular stakeholder groups that are still fighting against that grain, but we're beyond that. We really have to implement the policy and resources and set up these social learning systems. And kind of talk that we had this morning talked about those dynamic systems of having diverse learners, and we're talking about farmers, we're talking about biologists, we're talking about community members, etc. How do you get together? Well, what she was describing this morning is a community of practice, and if you can initiate that, then the chances of having greater success on improving the local ecosystem improves. But if you don't do that, then your chances just go way down. It's not that it may happen still, but I think it decreases your probability of it being successful. Yes, let's go.
I was thinking too is that like a lot of teachers I don't think know what environmental sustainability is, so it's hard to integrate that into a curriculum when they themselves don't know how to teach it. So is there programs to teach teachers before they can actually go and teach it themselves?
Yeah, I mean, I do that here at the Faculty of Education. So I do that not as a program, I do it as a course, but I tell you, it's challenging because it's not the entire program. It's one element of many things that they need to know.
Yeah.
So really, you can initiate them into that environmental sustainability, but they also need that ongoing professional learning that's required. And this is where universities can step in. And not just the Faculty of Ed, but the ESRC becomes a hub for learning for practitioners that want to engage and further their learning. Because there's certainly a swath of practitioners that are not familiar, as you said, with environmental sustainability and how it connects to other areas and things. But that's something that universities, I believe, have to step in, and that's part of their public outreach responsibility.
So I'm from Alberta. I went to school there.
Yes.
I'm just wondering to what extent provincial values and governments affect their curriculum. My nephew's in grade 9 and he has never heard of climate change before.
It's huge. Unfortunately, as I mentioned at the beginning of my talk, education is under provincial jurisdiction. That's the constitutional law we have in our country, which is different than the US, by the way. It's interesting, they actually have federal mandates for education. We actually have 0 federal mandate. I shouldn't say we have 1, which is French language. That's the only thing. After that, it's up to the provinces. We have no governing body that deals with this because it's not considered fundable. Why would we impede? It's no different in health, etc. So you'll get a lot of variation. Now Alberta, one thing that they do have is one of the strongest educational not-for-profit educational groups in environmental education. They're the best in the country. So there's a lot of resources. So it's interesting how they actually augment it.
Yeah.
Instead of being more policy formal, it's more grassroots. So they have one of the best. So if there's someone you know that's interested or if it works for you after when you go back to Alberta, I highly encourage you to contact the Alberta Council for Environmental Education. Excellent. Yes.
So yeah, thank you for your talk. It was really informative. You don't think about all these things when I'm thinking back to high school and how they kind of filter in. So I guess it's pretty clear that in Canada, educational is very provincial and territorial. Is there any way that some provinces are working to sort of teach or learn from other curriculums or other groups that sort of try to bridge gaps there?
Yeah, I mean, I'm being a little bit misleading if I said there isn't an organization. There's what's called the Council of Ministers of Education Canada, and every Minister of Education sits on this council. And what they do, one of the things they actually did is produced when we had the decade of environmental sustainability, they asked every country who participated to write a report, and that organization was charged with going to every province and saying, tell me what you did in Ontario, tell me Nova Scotia, tell me Alberta, tell me BC, tell me Northwest Territories. So that is probably one of the organizations that could help propel this forward. And I know Chuck Hopkins, who's the municipal chair, who's out of York University, has been doing that, but that's not enough. It just isn't enough, and I find that the only groups that are doing this are universities. Universities are sort of picking up the challenge and self-organizing and saying, okay, let's connect. So for example, our ESRC would connect with other universities across the country and form a consortium of sorts. I don't have an easy answer for that, but at the same time, we can't wait for any government or ministry to establish this organizing body. I think time is pressing, so I think we're going to have to do that work.
If there was a student who had a question, I don't want to.
No.
Okay, this will be quick.
Okay.
It's not even really so much a question as it is just appreciation for what you said, and I'm really thinking about some of the things that you've talked about in relation to some of the research that we've done and this idea of one-off activities not being effective and needing to develop that community of practice. I've always kind of thought about community of practice as an academic community of practice, that working within your field and connecting with others who do similar research. But I've never really thought about it from the perspective of, those communities that we go into and, for example, trying to do resilience assessments, trying to teach them about what we actually mean when we say resilience for, a day or two and then leave, and then seeing that there's not really a long-term impact. It all makes really good sense, and I think that, it's giving me a lot to think about, and I really appreciate that.
Yeah, academic communities of practice are important. It's just, when we're talking about the ecological challenges, diversity is critical, right? Having a diverse stakeholder group. And when you create a community of practice with diverse stakeholder group, that's hard work. That is hard work. And a lot of people shy away from that hard work. But that is the work that's going to take to deal with some of these social ecological challenges that we have. That's what it's going to take. And if you're not, keep thinking about those mismatches, right? Can I bring them all into a lecture hall and just talk about resilience and say, okay, you got the knowledge, off you go, and we'll see you next year? No, you got to go out there in the field, talk to them, and they have, through their learning through doing will help them incorporate and better understand some of those. While it's not a guarantee, again, I increase the probability of success. Yeah. Angela, you had a question?
You can go first, I've already asked, so.
Sure.
Yeah.
It was interesting how you compared the educational system to the complexity thinking that we apply in the sustainable systems, ecosystems. I was just wondering to what extent is it beneficial to keep adding complexity to any kind of model that we might have to understand the phenomena, rather than probably making a simpler model so it's more practical? Because in any field of education, the purpose of any kind of model is to simplify the real life situation so it's just easier to understand and perhaps apply it in real life.
I actually agree with you in part as well. I remember getting asked that. I've been dealing with complexity thinking in other contexts, and someone asked me a similar type of question, and I'm not sure we're able, as an individual, able to deal with that complexity. I think we individually struggle, but that's why socially we have to do this in groups. We need that collective. We need the collective mind, so to speak, to actually get this work done. So you're right. I think individually, we naturally have to simplify things. Otherwise, we get bogged down. We really get lost in the forest, so to speak. But the type of tools that, if you remember, Professor Jones talked about some of the systems thinking tools. That's where I think we begin to help ourselves out. Using those system thinking tools helps us to leverage some of the key complexity ideas and begins to give us more insights. So I think we have to get away from maybe using more traditional tools of analysis and maybe start using some of those systems thinking tools to better give us some insight into that complexity. I don't think we'll ever fully grasp it individually, but collectively I think we can.
I have two. Sorry.
No,
I have two questions. One is within the school setting, I have a teaching experience in Japan, and then when I talked about we didn't have a term sustainability in Japanese. It's just environment, the green environment, frankly. But when I talked about the sustainability stuff in school settings, well, for example, if I talk to a history teacher or something, they were like, "Oh, that's science. Don't come to me. Just go to science teacher."
Yes.
So I was just wondering how you could better integrate the all subjects into sustainability to have a holistic idea, to give students a holistic idea of sustainability. And the second part of my question is the financial issue that I think we all have a struggle as an educational discipline that finding funding for the education, especially for sustainability. It's not something that's directly related to the profit necessarily. So I was just wondering how you're coping with, or how we can better.
Okay, I mean, these are, we can talk hours and hours on both questions, but let me give you let me focus on the first one. Integrating learning for sustainability, environmental sustainability into all disciplines, I think has to start somewhere. And where it needs to start, I know my research has focused on schools, it has to start here at the university. If we can't model that, we cannot expect schools to suddenly be able to just do it magically or just leave it to the grade 5 teacher to do it and then they go to high school and it's all forgotten. I think we have to model it here. I think we have to go into what's called more integrated knowledge systems, which involves integrating, obviously, social sciences, the sciences, etc. The center is that hub. It begins to do that. That's what a lot of you are involved in right now. And I think that is the model that we need to use, and we have to transpose that to outside of the center to the rest of the university. So we have to sort of walk the walk and talk the talk. And then we can go to school systems, because the school systems are saying, well, we're preparing them to get to your place. And if you're not integrated, why would we be integrated, right? And so that is an important puzzle, especially for university settings. Now, not everyone goes into a university, not everyone needs to go into a university setting, but I think that's an important piece, that we have to begin to create the models, and that includes everything from not just teaching and learning, but if we accept students into our undergraduate programs and our graduate programs, are we just looking for what mark they got in calculus, what mark they got in chemistry, what mark they got in English? Or are we looking at some integrated examples of how they actually can demonstrate their proficiency and their abilities? And so I think we have to begin to create some models that will allow secondary schools to buy in to the type of thinking, integrated thinking that's required in dealing with environmental sustainability. Now, your second question related, and then again, that's a quick response, and then we can talk further about that. The second question you discussed with respect to funding and where we get funding. This may be a little controversial, but I think the funding is here. I think we have to redirect what we have. We have to take money from certain pots and move them into the priority areas. So we have to create a priority list. We're not going to get extra money from the government. I don't think we're going to get a lot of extra money from research funding. I don't think we're going to get a lot of extra money from donations. We're going to have to reallocate. And that's going to be difficult. And I think we have to do that kind of work if we want to move forward on supporting some of these important initiatives. So that's my opinion, of course, but I'm sure Ryan has been dealing with this for the last 5 years, but it's important. I just want to be cognizant of time. I know it's almost 12, so I don't know how much time we have left.
We have a bit of flux. If there's a few more questions, I mean, it's been a really invigorating discussion. So
okay. Yes.
Got a bit, as long as you're okay for
I'm fine, absolutely fine. So go ahead. I'd like to go.
I wanted to find out if they have an environmental sustainability part in high school curriculums or things like that, just to create the foundation before people come to the university setting, because back home we don't have any.
The closest thing, other than individual courses like science courses and geography courses where you may have a topic, like sort of what Angela was mentioning, or sort of a topic, there are some interesting programs happening with the co-op and vocational routes, interestingly, which don't necessarily feed into universities. We're seeing this is where the disconnect happens. So there's what are called schisms, and they're secondary school, high school pathways, where one of the schisms that you can focus in on is the environment. And within that, they actually can do sustainability practices through their co-op program. But how many of those programs or courses are recognized for entrance to a university? That's the disconnect that I'm talking about. So there's students that want to do this work. There's an environmental science course, for example, in Ontario. Which is more subscribed, the environmental science course or the chemistry course? Well, chemistry course. Why? Because we don't necessarily look at the environmental science course mark. So the students, while they love to take it, it's not important for admission. So unless, again, I believe we need to start to walk and talk to talk, and that's what we're looking forward.
You mentioned the monoculture learning environment, and I'm wondering if there are any curriculums out there that are making mandatory field courses to try to transition away from that monoculture, or if we should be creating mandatory.
Well, I mean, field courses in general, like in outdoor learning type of things, yeah, there are. I mean, certainly here we have field courses as well. I mean, when I was in university, I took 5 field courses, if I'm not mistaken. I mean, I think it's critical. But it's not just going out in the field, right? And, doing bird counts and weed counts and fish counts and things like that. You actually have to connect it to the social element of environmental sustainability. And there's not a lot of courses that do, from my understanding, that do both. And maybe, Ren, I don't know if there's any programs that do more of a social science, social ecological field outcome, other than co-op programs that you talked about. But there's nothing here, but I think that is a great type of program that could be developed. Yeah. And I know the speaker talked about one of the centers, the Succinct Center. That center in the US is trying to promote that, actually, exactly what you're talking about, both the social as well as the ecological.
I think that would be hard in terms of environmental sustainability though, because you get such diverse interests of people in sustainability. Personally, I wouldn't want to go into that fieldwork, but if you had the choice of which fieldwork, if I could go into an office and that would be fieldwork, that would be my interest, whereas another person in the same course as me is more interested in going out and so it's it's really hard, it's subjective, especially within sustainability.
I agree. I mean, you have to approach it from all diverse perspectives, right, in terms of the human systems interacting with the ecological system. It's not just in the field.
Yeah.
I can't thank you enough for joining us and for that enlightening and wonderful presentation. I have a question that I've been musing about, and I don't know if you've been thinking about this or not, but with the move at Brock and our commitment now to experiential education,
right,
and their powers that be are trying to integrate that wherever they can,
mm-hmm.
do you see that as a potential opening window of opportunity towards more social learning models? And I guess the second part, which if you think that we might be able to use that opening to do that, how would we actually measure social learning then if we could kind of catalyze it here at Brock? And I'm using your jumping off point about the center,
yeah,
and how you kind of get that idea that the center has, and how do we actually start taking it out across
the ways. I think the experiential learning can lead to that, but in and of itself it won't.
Right.
So it has to be constructed in such a way so that it actually has all the elements in place for the social learning system. Putting a student out to do work on their own, it doesn't actually lead to necessarily learning in terms of the outcomes. Now, getting to your outcome question, there are particular metrics that you can use to actually look at social learning. They are more qualitative, but for example, the research that I've done, one thing you begin to see is when you have the social system, and I just want to quickly go back to that. If you have the social system, what you start to see, for example, is this. The leader is a good example. The facilitation leader actually disappears. It disappears not that they actually leave, but you actually don't notice them because the individuals actually start taking up the leadership roles. That is a good indicator that this is working. So when they take on the leadership roles themselves, obviously the growth in knowledge, that a new knowledge that's different, that's contextual, that applies to the challenge that they're working on is also an important element. So there's a knowledge component. And finally, the practices. You look at the routines, how they change the routines, what they started with, what are the new routines as well. Those are the things that are sort of indicators that you can use. So this is a nice model because it actually helps you to look for those particular things. So the experiential learning in and of itself won't necessarily get to that, although it can, right? But it has to be set up. But it's a good way. Angela.
So I'm glad I kind of waited at the end because a lot of what I was going to ask about has been answered or discussed already, so that's good. But I also don't want to end on a negative note, but I found that one of the biggest challenges that I've had going through like my BEd and also teaching in schools is the one-off experiences or the lack of support, as we talked about, and so on. To include these social learning approaches and to have these models that we all aspire to that are so ideal in the real world, I've found from other teachers that I've had practice teaching with in the sciences, they, EQAO standardized tests, they have to meet those requirements. They don't have time, like in Quebec at least, it's final exams are written by the ministry, so you have to meet those requirements, and the lack of time means that you can't necessarily leave the classroom, and it's really challenging and it's really depressing in a way that like you want to do these sort of approaches, but it's just like the resources and the capacity, it's just not there.
Yeah, and I mentioned that, right? Just remember some of the challenge areas here.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, this is for elementary, secondary schools. This can be also in post-secondary, right? I mean, it's the same kind of challenges. But again, this is where I believe in terms of the resource question and funding, you start putting funding towards some of these things and things happen. And the successful programs do this. They redirect, and it's not huge amounts of resources. It's just a redirecting, a reprioritization. A leader who comes up and says, you know what, I'm going to support you in your initiative. That makes all the difference to get them going. Now, social learning systems are not meant to run in perpetuity, right? They have a beginning and they actually have an end. And so then it becomes another type of system, which may be very different. So that's one thing to look at it. You want to make it sustainable over time, but it's not forever, right? It has a beginning, it has an end, and what's the next learning system? So yes, it's difficult, it's hard work. But I think, again, we have the tools in place in terms of how to put it together. We just need some support in moving forward.
And I guess another challenge that I found is breaking out of these traditions, especially within science specifically. They have those traditions of, even within universities, it's
Sure.
traditionally very
Absolutely.
siloed, and so breaking through those has been a challenge. But I like what you said about how the university has to be sort of the example.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, they're the academic lead in the community, and the schools are academic institutions. So you think naturally, universities, they also colleges, et cetera, it's post-secondary. They have to walk the walk, and we can't tell them, oh, I want you to do this, but I'm not going to change the way I do anything. Just when you let them get here, then I'll mold them. Well, the stats are showing that they actually are not coming anymore. They don't want to go into these programs. They just find their own way. And for better or for worse, we have to adapt as well. And I think if we want to adapt to learning for sustainability, then we have to do that kind of work. So, that will end it.
That's great. I'll turn over to Xavier.
Okay, so on behalf of everyone, we'd like to say thank you for sharing your knowledge and reminding us of how much work there is to do to get there.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, and thank you. If anyone wants to talk further, by all means, more than happy to.
Thank you.